And okay, so stop the recording.
This meeting is being recorded.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's edition of Weathering the Storm, which is a joint collaboration between the Earth Day Everyday webinar series, which is part of Rutgers Cooperative Extension, and the Rutgers Extension Marine Extension Program. The program is being recorded tonight. Just a couple of housekeeping matters. If you'd like to talk to the panelists and ask questions of the speaker, feel free to do that in the Q&A, which should be available through your Zoom app. And the chat section is disabled for participants. A little bit later, we will be having a poll open where we're asking for some feedback, but feel free to ask questions in that Q&A section. Tonight, we are very happy to have Christopher Miller, who is the manager and conservation agronomist at the Cape May Plant Materials Center. He will be speaking about strategies to minimize the impacts of coastal flooding and saltwater inundation on agricultural lands. Chris is currently the manager of the United States Department of Agriculture Natural Resources Conservation Service Cape May Plant Materials Center. He has been there since 2000, or he's had this position since 2009. Prior to this, he served for 18 years as an NRCS field plant material specialist for the Northeastern and Mid-Atlantic states. He provides guidance to he provides technical guidance to NRCS state technical specialists in the field offices and conservation districts. Chris has a BS degree, Bachelor's of Science degree in agronomy from Pennsylvania State University, and a Master's of Science degree in plant and soil science from South Dakota State University. If I could just ask you to back up a couple slides.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right there?
Yes, so later on we'll be having a poll. This is a voluntary poll, and because we will be collecting this data and analyzing it, we'll ask for your consent to be a part of this study. And so when we open the poll near the end of the talk, you'll be asked if you consent to us using this data. Next slide, please.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Rutgers Cooperative Extension, in partnership with the USDA, provides all its educational programming without discrimination. And if you there are ways to contact the USDA or the university if you feel the need to do so. Thanks. Next slide. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Christopher Miller. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm honored to be a part of the group of speakers and presenters for this webinar series. And I'm going to focus tonight on some work that we've been doing and some collaborations with other institutions on strategies to minimize the impacts of coastal flooding and saltwater inundation on ag lands. Some of the concepts I talk about are also applicable for, vacant properties where you want to, plant some vegetation or gardens or demonstration plant areas, or it's not just on large scale agricultural fields. But notice I use the term minimize. In most cases, depending on the severity and frequency of flooding and salt impacts, it may not be possible to completely ameliorate those impacts, but what we try to do is we try to minimize those as much as possible. And I'll talk about those things as I go through my presentation. So I do work at the Cape May Plant Materials Center. We're in Cape May Courthouse, New Jersey, and this facility was established in 1965 to test and select plants for coastal applications. I would say primarily for the first 50 years of our existence, we focused on coastal sand dune stabilization and also tidal shoreline stabilization. and also have done, a little bit of work on cover crops and windbreaks and wind barriers for, farming applications, as it relates to the coastal plain soils, which are typically droughty, sandy, low nutrient soils of the coastal plain. Actually, much of our property is actually downer sandy loam, which is the state soil. If you didn't realize that there was a New Jersey state soil, it's the downer sandy loam, which occupies, I forget exactly the extent of acreage in southern New Jersey, but it's in forest land and cropland in southern New Jersey. And it's a fairly sandy soil with some gravelly lenses in it. And we actually have much of our property here mapped as downer sandy loam. In more recent years, I would say in the last 7 to 10 years or so, we've been focusing more and more on this issue of addressing the saltwater intrusion issue due to coastal flooding as a result of more frequent storms, more intense storms, sea level rise, land subsidence. So all these issues come into play that are impacting agriculture, from a salt and flooding standpoint. Um, we have a facility here in Cape May Courthouse. We're 84 acres. Again, we've focused on coastal shorelines and disturbed areas, critical areas as it relates to disturbed or man-made disturbance, sand and gravel pits, mined areas, hurricane impacted areas, um, and our focus is developing coastal plant technology, and we have a service area that actually includes 9 states from southern New England down to North Carolina, meaning that we address issues involved in those states and work with our network of partners and field office, NRCS field office, and USDA field office folks in those particular states. The only thing I'll mention about Superstorm Sandy is that obviously the area which was ground zero, which was central New Jersey, where the iconic roller coaster, off of Seaside Park or Seaside Heights, I think it was. I actually happened to drive through that area the following spring and summer, and, the thought occurred to me that, in the midst of all this infrastructure destruction, you notice the photo on the left where the basically the storm surge went right through the home. This is along Route 35 in the Maniloking, Maniloking to Seaside Heights or Seaside Park area. Uh, there was a magnolia in bloom, in the late spring, early summer of that, the following season after after Sandy hit in October of 2012. Um, Likewise, at the Seaside Park municipal complex, I had been involved a few years prior, helping them establish a native plant garden. And sure enough, the summer of the following year after Superstorm Sandy, the garden looked like it had when we first established it, the few years prior to Superstorm Sandy. And so the thought occurred to me that that the plants can be very resilient and are very resilient in a lot of cases. Um, and a lot has to do with the timing of the storm. If my contention is, and I don't know that I've seen much in the way of research data, but my contention is that storms that occur during the dormant time of the year, so like our winter nor'easter storms, actually cause less damage to the vegetation from salt, because the plants aren't actively growing. They're not actually photosynthesizing. They're not taking up nutrients. They're not being impacted by the salt nearly as much as, say, a summer hurricane that comes up the coast. The vegetation is much more negatively impacted, by a storm that occurs during the growing season. So I think that's why we're seeing the resilience of these plants, and that the Sandy was a late October storm, so the plants were starting to shut down, and then the following spring and summer they came back, and a lot of the salts were actually leached out of the soil at that point. So what makes a plant resilient? What makes the coastal plant resilient? So ability to rebound from scour or damage, and in the cases of woody plants, stump sprouting or root suckering, or growing from the crown from the standpoint of a herbaceous plant. ability to tolerate the saltwater flooding and alternating wet-dry conditions. So, we have our facultative plants. From a wetland indicator standpoint, those are sort of the plants, groups of plants that tolerate alternating wet and dry conditions. Those are pretty resilient in these kind of conditions. Obviously, heat and drought tolerance is important. Actually, salinity actually simulates drought, and I'll talk about that in a few slides from now. Because it actually it actually through osmotic pressure, it wants to suck the water out of the plant. So plants that are somewhat drought tolerant, in a lot of cases, are also salinity tolerant. Obviously, plants that spread rapidly by seed or rhizomes are often very resilient. And again, plants that are adaptable to a wide range of environmental, soil, and site conditions are very resilient. So if we talk about salt impacts, we think traditionally we think about plants out west in the arid and semi-arid regions of the Midwest and West. But we're more concerned, obviously, here, and even though it's a really relatively small land area, 1% to 2% or so, and that figures something I think something I got like probably 6 or 7 years ago. It's increasing over time, and even though it's a small percentage of aerial land or acreage wise, it does affect more and more farmers all the time. And if you are affected, of course, it's very important to you, and it's really become an issue since Superstorm Sandy. But even back, I remember getting calls back in 2003 when Hurricane Isabel came up the Chesapeake Bay, and I was getting some inquiries from our field offices down on the lower eastern shore of Maryland and in Delaware about what to do about saltwater impacts. And since Superstorm Sandy, of course, it's dramatically the number of requests for technical assistance have increased. And so that's why we've sort of tweaked our program here at our Plant Materials Center to address those issues. So this just shows a map. I think this was a map that was in National Geographic showing that along the southern Delaware Bay, in Delaware and southern New Jersey, and then down the Atlantic coast, and obviously along the Chesapeake Bay, particularly the lower Chesapeake Bay, is where we see most of our issues with saltwater intrusion due to subsidence of the land surface, due to sea level rise, due to more frequent storms. All these things are contributing to this particular problem. And, not just in the mid-Atlantic, but in eastern North Carolina, there's very severe issues. And of course, the Gulf Coast we've heard about for many years down in Louisiana and Texas. And, the land sinking down there also as the sea level's rising. In southern Florida, and even in the Carolinas, South Carolina and Georgia, it's becoming more and more of an issue. So like scenes like this is in eastern North Carolina. These fields had been cleared back in the 60s. It used to be forest land, were cleared for agricultural land, and all these drainage ditches were put in to drain the fresh water to allow for agricultural production. However, what's happening now with sea level rise and more frequent storms and more intense storms, that these ditches and canals are becoming conduits for salt water to creep further inland and even further negatively impact cropland. Closer to home, this is a sod farm on the Cape May Cumberland border in Eldora area along the Chesapeake Bay. The sod production is impacted by coastal flooding from the Delaware Bay, and you can see the dead trees in the background. You can see Phragmites moving in, and so this particular area has been impacted, in more recent years. So what are the drivers of this saltwater intrusion? So sea level rise, storms, tides, drought can actually exacerbate salt issues. How we manage our water from a groundwater standpoint, we're pulling more water from the ground, so we're actually, have the potential to suck the salt water in, even though the salt water is heavier and is lower in elevation. If we use that fresh water above it, then we're starting to pull salt water into our wells. And then, as I just mentioned, the connectivity with the ditches and the canals and things. And so all this leads to, forest loss, a spread of invasive species, yield declines from a cropland standpoint. There's some research done on the lower eastern shore of Maryland that saltwater intrusion actually releases legacy phosphorus and nitrate from the soil, and results in eutrophication of the water body, because you're actually getting an influx of more phosphorus and more nitrates into the tributaries of the bay. And then, of course, marsh migration. Marshes are migrating upland or upslope. We're losing more low marsh. We're losing more high marsh. The low marsh is actually turning into open water. So all these things are happening simultaneously. So I just wanted to give credit to Jared Miller, no relation to myself, but he's an extension specialist with the University of Delaware, who put together a really nice presentation on sort of a salt chemistry 101 or so. And I thought, rather than try to duplicate some of the information that he has, I figured I would just borrow some of his slides, which he was fine with me doing. So I just wanted to give him credit for that, and appreciate the information he's provided me. But most of our commonly known salts are actually, a lot of our fertilizers are salts, and salts actually contain plant nutrients. Potassium, calcium, ammonium, magnesium. All these are also plant nutrients as well as salts. So they're not really a problem at lower concentrations, but they can become a problem at higher concentrations. The one salt that is not a plant nutrient is sodium. So sodium in really high concentrations, that's where you have problems with soil structure. You have problems with sodium toxicity to the plant, and so that's really the bad one, is sodium in particular. So how are salts measured in the soil? So we use salts actually conduct electricity. So it's electrical conductivity can be measured with probes. And basically these dissolved salts have a charge. So the more salts you have, the more it will conduct electricity. And the units of measurements are typically millimoles per centimeter or decisiemens per meter. And so these are like the salt measurements are surrogates to concentrations of salt. And there's a lot of different units to measure salt, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but won't go into a lot of detail. And there's conversion factors to take the units of measurement from millimoles to centimeter to, so say, parts per thousand of salt concentration. So from conductance to concentration. And I'll explain that in a little more detail in a few slides. So soils are negatively charged, and they attract the positively charged cations, which are our salts. So we just need to be careful about how many of those cation exchange sites on the soil are actually occupied by salts, particularly sodium. Like I mentioned, that sodium is the bad one. Also, the amount of water in the soil has an impact on the concentration of salt. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you see that there's more water, so the salts are somewhat diluted in a higher concentration of water, and more water, so they're more dilute. On the right-hand side, the salts are more concentrated because there's less water. So when the salts become more concentrated, they pull more water out of whatever plants may be actively growing there. So drier soils have a larger osmotic effect on the soils, and simulate drought even more than soils that contain more water or have are more saturated with water. So in other words, if the salt concentration's higher outside in the soil outside the plant root, the water will be actually drawn from the plant root itself. And that's the simulation of drought that occurs with a high concentration of salts in the soil. As I mentioned in the slide I showed of the North Carolina, the higher sea levels and land subsidence, the salts often come in on those drainage ditches under under storm events or under even just under higher monthly tide events and king tide events. So they're conduits of bringing salt into further into cropland. And then if you have evaporation occurring, that's when you get the white powder or white salt crystals, on the surface. And you can see in this photo on the left-hand side, there's pretty much nothing growing in those areas where the salt has accumulated on the surface. No, you don't even have any tidal marsh plants even growing there. The salt concentration is so high. So you have high tides bringing in salt water, you have hurricanes bringing in salt water, and you have rising sea levels bringing in salt water. So brackish waters can range anywhere from 0.5 to 25 parts per thousand. And salt water is typically above 25 parts per thousand, up to 35 parts per thousand or more. So ocean water is actually 35 as a benchmark. So brackish is sort of mid, from 0.5 to 25. That's considered brackish. And there's a wider range of plants that tolerate brackish waters than tolerate pure salt water. And then of course, and when you're in freshwater, you even have a higher range of plants. And again, you can see these are drone photos that actually Jared Miller took along the lower Chesapeake Bay, and you can see all the salts that are accumulating, in these fields, in these crop fields, and in these areas along the tributaries to the Chesapeake Bay. So the structure is also, it's not just the effect on the plant itself, but it's also the structure of the soil. So ions in the soil can either create structure or destroy structure. Again, sodium is the worst because it disperses soil particles, meaning that there's no structure there. So so the soil crusts over and it makes infiltration into the soil very difficult. Calcium actually encourages soil structure and helps create those small ped-ons, and it actually encourages infiltration. From an irrigation standpoint, much of our soils out west are impacted negatively by irrigation. That is, by irrigating crops that have a higher salt concentration in them. So, and even in the east here, I mean, most of our wells are freshwater, but if you're actually drawing water from a tidal tributary, for instance, you want to make sure, particularly in the summertime, and you want to make sure that your salt concentration of that tributary is relatively low if you're going to be using that surface water for irrigation purposes. Again, showing that sort of that wedge between saline and freshwater. And so, you're getting tidal surge from hurricanes, you got tides moving up the ditches, you got saline groundwater from rising sea level. And that wedge just keeps forcing itself into the freshwater zone. Tidal surges bring in, excessive salts, sodium, calcium, magnesium, sulfates, and what we try to do is if there's an excess amount of sodium in the soil, if the soil has good drainage, if it's a sandier soil and doesn't have any confining layers in it, you can often use gypsum, which is calcium sulfate, to replace the sodium on the exchange sites. And as long as you have good fresh water for irrigation, or you're getting a good amount of rainfall, you can actually wash the sodium out of the soil profile after it's replaced with the calcium from the gypsum application. However, if you have a poor drainage soil, you're pretty much stuck because there's going to be no way of draining that sodium. Even if you try to use gypsum to replace the sodium with calcium, you're not going to be able to wash the sodium out of the root zone because of the poor drainage, either due to impervious layer, either due to a high water table, or due to clay. So you're, in a situation like this, you're often going to be stuck with, just allowing that soil to maybe convert to, rather than using it for crops, convert to tidal marsh. So again, with rising sea levels, you have that wedge of saline water, which is denser and heavier underneath the freshwater, but pushing its way inland more and more. And that's what, we're seeing more and more problems with coastal forests because of that phenomenon, actually. And it's not really just the salt water that's moving inland. It's just also raising the elevation of the freshwater. So, for example, some forest trees, don't like to be in standing water, but they're actually being inundated with not just saline water, but even with fresh water, because of the push of the saline water underneath it, that's raising the elevation of the groundwater table, to these forest trees, and resulting in them the basically the mortality of those particular trees, just due to the higher water table, not just the salt water effect. So again, I mentioned that if you do have a high level of sodium in your soil, and you do have a good a soil from a drainage standpoint or a leaching standpoint, you can often remediate that soil by adding gypsum and replacing the sodium with the calcium. However, if you have a soil that doesn't drain very well, that's not going to be a possibility. So I don't mean to confuse you with this particular table, but there's a lot of different units that folks use throughout the world to measure salinity. In particular, we use the conductivity, the decisiemens per meter, the electrical conductivity, which is the far left-hand column here, and also the parts per thousand. So if you just focus on those, and these are, synonymous, units. So in other words, 1.7 to 8 decisiemens per meter, which is a medium brackish, is the same as 1 to 5 parts per thousand, or 8 to 25 decisiemens per meter, which is a strong or well, what's considered just brackish here is a 5 to 15 parts per thousand. So this was a convenient table that I found in some European work that's been done in the Netherlands, which really kind of put those two units in perspective. There are conversion factors you can use to, convert, from one to any of these units, as a matter of fact. But like I said, we typically focus on the electrical conductivity in decisiemens per meter, or the parts per thousand. And this table below, with the crop and the salinity tolerance in parts per thousand, just kind of gives you an idea of the relative salt tolerance of these various crops. Can you see things like sweet potato and corn and tomatoes are really relatively low, whereas the small grains and sorghum are a little bit higher. There's been some work done with soybean to make it more salt tolerant by genetically modifying it, so that's a little bit higher. And then you have your your restoration species, or your native grasses, or your salt marsh plants like switchgrass and salt marsh, or salt meadow cordgrass, which is much higher on that range of parts per thousand tolerance. And that's kind of the arena where most of the work that we're doing is in that higher salt tolerant level. We're not really working with commodity crops or with vegetable crops or things like that. We're looking at the higher salt tolerance for I'm going to explain it in a little bit, but from a value added niche crop standpoint, as well as crops for buffers to provide ecosystem services. So there are various mechanisms that plants also use, as far as their salt tolerance. And, we refer to halophytes. Halophytes are actually our salt-loving plants. So in other words, they prefer to actually be growing in salt water. They actually incorporate salt water or saline water into their tissue, and exude the extra salt through their glands. For example, our tidal marsh plants, our disticulus, which is a salt grass, our spartinas, which are cord grasses, and salicornia, which is the glasswort, which is that succulent plant. that you see growing in the marsh, which turns a bright red color this time of year. So these are all halophytes. These are salt-loving plants. They do best when they're growing in salt water. They would be much less competitive in a lower salt environment. And then there's another group of plants that do tolerate soil salt and saltwater flooding because they are relatively drought tolerant plants. So they can tolerate that soil salt because again, it simulates drought, and these plants are very tolerant to drought, whether it's just drought with lack of water in the soil, or whether it's drought as a result of salt affected soils. So those are like our native grasses, our native warm season grasses, like switchgrass, coastal panic grass, eastern gamma grass. These are all very dominant grasses in the coastal plain and along coastal areas, along our upper margins of our tidal marshes. Um, and again, they do tolerate that salt because they can also tolerate drought. And then, but they also tolerate some flooding, which is good. But then there's another group of plants that tolerate a little bit of soil salt, but they don't tolerate flooding, whether it's from salt water or fresh water. And those would be, a few of our turf grasses like tall fescue and red fescue are somewhat salt tolerant. A few vegetable crops like asparagus and potatoes and sugar beets are fairly salt tolerant just inherently. And then small grains, which I already mentioned, and sorghum Sudan grass. Those are all fairly tolerant uh, uh, grouping of crops um, and grasses. And then you have a group of plants that are salt spray adaptable, like your coastal shrubs, like bayberry, beach plum, in your tree, like American holly, and some of the native grapes that grow along the shoreline have thick leaves or waxy leaves that help protect them from salt. And they can also tolerate some occasional overwash with salt water, but they don't like to be growing in salt water or in soils that are really high in salts, but can tolerate some of the occasional overwash from storms as well as the constant salt spray. In the Netherlands, I had an opportunity a few years ago to go to some trials that they were doing with crops over there, and they were basically subjecting a lot of different vegetable crops and brassicas and cold crops and things, and some native European crops to different levels of salt content, and to see inherently they weren't doing any breeding. They were just doing natural selection to see which crops would be more tolerant. And so they had these drip lines that had different concentrations of salt going to different sections of these plots, and they were monitoring yield from those to seeing which ones that were the most tolerant to various levels of salt. And they did actually identify that they have a salt, what they call a salt potato now. So they have a potato crop that's actually inherently, it wasn't bred, but it's inherently a variety of potato that's very tolerant to salt. And they're doing that with a wide range of crops over there. And it's kind of analogous. The reason why I showed it's analogous to what we do in our plant materials program is we subject our plants to different levels of salt, or to different to drought, or to shoreline conditions or whatever, and see inherently what those different varieties of conservation plants will be able to tolerate. So we also don't do breeding in our plant program. We do what's referred to as natural selection or natural observation. Now, universities out west are looking at various crops and looking at at what level of salt concentration do you have a 10% loss in yield, or a 25% loss in yield, or even a 50% loss in yield. So that's kind of how a lot of the folks out west actually look at salt concentration, is how it impacts the crop from a loss standpoint, and whether it's a 10, 25, 50, or even 75% loss. But notice that I mentioned small grains are relatively salt tolerant compared to some other crops. Notice that you have to have a much higher salt concentration for barley, for example, it's at 17 decisiemens per meter to get a 50% loss of that crop. Whereas for watermelon or corn, you have a much lower salt concentration will give you that 50% loss. So that kind of just gives you a, tabular way of looking at the relative salt tolerance of these, different crops and grasses and things. So over in Europe, they're looking at, crop and cultivar choice as far as the range of tolerances, irrigation practices. They're looking at sandy versus clayey soils. Obviously, sandy is a much better situation to be irrigating with salt water because your CEC is much lower with sandy soils. In other words, you don't have as much exchange sites to absorb the potential salts onto those exchange sites. Again, fertilizers are salts in themselves. Many of them are. So you have to be careful about how much fertilization you apply. And then from a soil management standpoint, good soil quality or soil health practices like in improving the soil organic matter, minimizing tillage, using mulches and residues, all those help minimize the impact of higher concentrations of salt in the soil. We in our agency, we have like the 4 principles of soil health. On the left, the far left-hand column, those principles would be, minimizing soil disturbance as much as possible, maximizing soil cover throughout the year. So having cover crops on in the winter, having something there, obviously during the growing season, maximizing biodiversity. So using more than just a monoculture of a cover crop, for instance, and then maximizing living roots. And that's again having something actively growing on that soil for as much a length of time during the 12-month period as possible. And then the check marks, for the different conservation practices, just kind of give you an indication of which of those principles that conservation practice will address. For example, conservation cover addresses all of the soil health principles, whereas mulching, which is a practice we use in our conservation field office tech guide, only covers that maximizing soil cover aspect, nothing else. Prescribed grazing is a good one too. So you have active grass growing or plants growing throughout the 12-month period. So what I really wanted to focus on with this slide was just mentioning those 4 main principles of soil health, and utilizing those can all mitigate the effect of salt impacts. Here's an example of using mulches and using drip for irrigation purposes. Those are 2 good practices to minimize the evapotranspiration. So salts will come to the surface through evapotranspiration. So you want to try to minimize that as much as possible if you do have salts in the soil. So the mitigation would be, would be a list of things you could potentially do to minimize the impact or mitigate the impact of salt affected soils. And generally these are relatively short-term quick fixes. So it's not something you could do over a long period of time, depending on the severity of the, and frequency of the, say the flooding or the salt impacts. But a lot of these I've already talked about, allowing the excess salts to leach, planting on a raised bed so the plant roots aren't in a higher concentration of salt, adding gypsum, as I already talked about, incorporating organic materials to add organic matter, and then growing those salt tolerant cover crops for a season or 2 to minimize the impact of the salts in the soils. So these are all mitigation impacts. Some more longer term things that could be done depending on your situation and your soil and the type of operation you have would be, obviously moving crop production to higher ground, which is what a lot of farmers have been doing on the lower eastern shore of Maryland, for instance, or applying through a farm bill program through NRCS or USDA for a wetland easement. So if it's a situation where your crops are always flooded out, you might just want to consider just allowing that land to convert to wetland. Planting a more salt tolerant crop, as I talked about, some plants and some varieties of crops have an inherent tolerance to various levels of salt concentration in the soil. So obviously you need to test your soil, and you need to know what the salt concentration is in order to plan for whatever crops you might want to grow that might have some tolerance to that. We're focusing quite a bit in our program now on salt tolerant native plant buffers, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then, applying appropriate conservation practices, to help ameliorate the salt impacts, and just basically using good land management practice by having riparian riparian herbaceous cover, filter strips along the edges of fields or field borders. As I mentioned, the conservation cover practices basically covers the land in a diversity of living vegetation throughout the year. Of course, stream bank and shoreline protection is good if your land is adjacent to any tidal creeks or tributaries or shoreline. And then critical area planting is basically planting disturbed areas that have been maybe damaged by storms or flooding or whatever. And then there's some opportunities to grow value-added alternative crops, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit also. Some conservation plants that have some market value, like salt hay, for instance. We put together a publication a few years ago. I was fortunate enough to be a co-author on this on identification, mitigation, and adaptation to salinization on working lands in the U.S. Southeast, but it's also applicable for the Mid-Atlantic. And I believe if you just Google that title, or look on the USDA Climate Hub's webpage for the Southeast Climate Hub, you'll come to this publication. But what we wanted to do was kind of put together information that would be accessible to the layperson, and try to give the landowner some guidance on what mitigation and what adaptation practices will be most applicable for his or her operation, or his or her soils and things like that. So one of the sort of the key mark information in this document is looking at the stage of salinity that your particular piece of land might be subject to. And it ranges everywhere from stage 0, which is basically non-impacted. So you're not impacted at all by saltwater, or very low saltwater impacts, to stage 5 on the other extreme, which would be chronic, chronic effects from saltwater or flooding. And so, there's a few stages in between. You have stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, with various levels of episodic salinity effects. And we've indicated whether maybe one or more of those mitigation impacts that I talked about would be applicable, or one or more of those adaptation strategies might work depending on the stage of impact you're in. So we just kind of wanted to put sideboards on, so how frequently is your land flooded? What kind of soils do you have? What's the level of salt impacts? And whether you might want to consider a wetland easement versus maybe just doing an adaptation strategy, or doing a mitigation strategy, or maybe a combination of mitigation and adaptation. And then once you kind of figure out where you're in the scheme of these stages, then there's more information in the document that leads you to one or more of the potential remedies. So we're pretty proud of the document and the use it's getting, and it's downloadable as a PDF off the website. So you just Google that title. So let's focus on opportunities. I just take a break here to get a drink. So we focus in our plant materials program on conservation plants, not food crops. But conservation plants can serve, for providing ecosystem services, as well as potential income. For example, we're losing we're losing a lot of our high marsh, and we're losing areas in southern New England and southern New Jersey and Delaware and even down into Maryland, where where salt hay used to be harvested from the natural marsh, that was protected by dikes and levees. So a lot of those dikes and levees have been destroyed by storms. The sea level's rising, so there's those areas that used to be harvested from the marsh for a salt hay mulch, which is highly desirable for a lot of folks because it's weed free. It prevents weeds from growing in your crop, and so there's a lot of benefits. But to harvest it from a natural marsh now is all, and it is has become nearly impossible. So we're encouraging farmers and working towards providing the information, the economics. We know how to grow these crops, but it's really figuring out the what your potential marketplace is and the economics of growing these in an area that say in cropland that's being impacted more and more by storms and by flooding. So can you convert that cropland to a salt hay crop and make money off of it? If certainly not forever, with sea level rise and more storms and more frequent problems, but maybe to bide some time for 5-10 years or so, and actually get an income rather than just abandoning it from a crop standpoint. There's also the opportunities to maybe produce a biomass crop or a fiber crop by planting a native warm season grass. um, the fibers from the stems of these grasses are actually highly absorbent and have been tested for bedding, for animal bedding, and have actually turned out to be very good quality material to use as animal bedding, even better in some cases than the wood, or excuse me, the cedar chip bedding or the pine chip bedding that's commonly used for horses and even for poultry houses. So there's potential opportunities there. Again, it's a matter of developing the market, a matter of providing enough acreage of these plants that can be harvested that will supply the need. And then there's a possibility of growing coastal shrubs for harvesting during the dormant season to actually provide material to stabilize shorelines, like the baccharis or groundsel, iva, arrowwood. There aren't too many willows that have salt tolerance, but there may be a few that we're going to try to identify, because willows have a good ability to root from an unrooted cutting or a stem and provide stabilization to the shoreline. So just a few pictures of some of those things. So the salt hay or salt meadow cordgrass grows a little bit higher in elevation than the smooth cordgrass, which grows in the intertidal zone. It is valued as a weed free mulch. Demand is high still, but supplies are low because farmers aren't harvesting it from the mulch from the marsh anymore. And we're looking at a few different varieties that have been selected through our plant materials program to see which one might be best for this particular use. So it can also provide suitable nesting habitat for the salt marsh sparrow, which is a threatened bird species. Um, and again, you get potentially you could get 3.5 to 6 tons per acre off of a good stand of salt hay. And trying to figure out the economics and how much potential income would be gained by that. And again, you're getting by establishing a cordgrass crop or a salt hay crop in areas that used to be farmland. You're getting erosion resistance, and you're actually encouraging sort of the natural marsh progression inland, that's happening naturally anyway, but you're actually being more proactive. And then we have these groups of native grass species that can be used for buffers, for water quality improvement, for sediment control, for even stabilizing shorelines and stream banks. And we did a study a few years ago with the Ag Research Service, which is our sister agency in USDA. And the three top performing, this table just shows relative ranking, with 1 being the best and 9 being the worst. And so if you just look at this overall, this last column, the prairie cordgrass, that's PC, the switchgrass, that's SG, and the eastern gamma grass are 3 native warm season grasses that we that we grow here at our Plant Materials Center, those were the top 3 performing grasses in this particular study. Now, this was done in a freshwater environment, but it so happens that those 3 grasses also have some level of salt tolerance, and we're actually doing some saltwater screening in our greenhouse, as well as planting these out in actual salt impacted sites to see what their level of salt tolerance is. So they perform very well in a freshwater environment. We think they'll perform almost equally as well in a saltwater environment. So this is our goal, would be to have a multifunctional riparian buffer between our crop field, and you can't see the ditch here, but there's a ditch right along this this gravel road. And you have the buffer between the ditch, which is brackish, the brackish water, bringing in saline water from the tributary of the bay, and potentially protecting this crop field. In an adjacent farm, there was actually a ditch that had Spartina alterniflora in it, which is and this is on the lower eastern shore of Maryland, which is the salt meadow cordgrass is the intertidal cordgrass species. And I don't believe that I've ever seen the smooth cordgrass growing adjacent to a soybean field ever before. So, you had soybeans growing right next to this natural high, basically a halophyte, a plant that has a high salt tolerant level. And of course, under storm events, this ditch is going to flood into the crop field, into the soybean field, and negatively impact that particular crop. So that's why we're encouraging buffers in this particular kind of environment. So ideally, you would like to have, and this is, I guess, a little busy from a graphic standpoint, but I just want to show that on the far right here, you have your open water, then you have your riverine or estuarine system, your marsh, your tidal wetland. Ideally, you want to have either a natural buffer or a managed buffer between that estuary or that tidal marsh and whatever is upland from that, whether it be forest land, whether it be cropland, or whether it be your infrastructure. Because what we're seeing is these storm tides and high tides coming in even further upland, and by having these natural buffers or managed buffers, you're gaining more protection to the upland sites, the terrestrial ecosystems, the forest land, the cropland, and even the infrastructure protection. And we're looking more at the roots too. These roots are dynamic. You have roots dying off and new roots being generated. And it's the fibrous roots, the smaller fibrous roots they're taking up the nutrients. It's the larger straw-like, what we refer to as parenchyma roots, that allow for oxygen exchange under highly saturated conditions in the soil. So those are your wetland plants. Often have these larger straw-like roots that allow for oxygen exchange under low oxygen or saturated soil conditions. And we're looking at, in a greenhouse, we're starting out looking at the root versus top growth issue under different salinity levels for a few of the native warm season grasses that we work with, the prairie cord, the eastern gamma, the switch, coastal panic grass. And we're using the salt meadow cordgrass, which is basically a halophyte, as a standard of comparison. And we have these tables. We have these tables in the greenhouse called ebb and flow tables that have a reservoir of water underneath, and we can put different concentrations of salt in each of those reservoirs. And so we'll have a control, we'll have a 5 parts per thousand, we'll have a 15 parts per thousand, and we'll have a 25 parts per thousand. And we'll grow these plants basically hydroponically, because we have them growing in the perlite, which is non-reactive. So basically it's just a substrate for the roots to hold on to. It doesn't hold salts or water. And we'll see how the different levels of salt concentration impact the impact the vegetation, both the top growth and the root growth. So for prairie cordgrass, which we know is a lower salt tolerance than, say, our because it's often referred to as freshwater cordgrass, but it does have some salt tolerance. We already knew that when we started out. And as it turns out, when we did this study, it was 8 weeks in the greenhouse under those different salinity conditions. We measured the top growth and the root growth, and you notice from 0 to 5 to 15 to 25, we definitely got a dramatic drop off in the amount of top growth and root growth from say 15 to 25 parts per thousand. From 0 to 5, and even to a certain extent from 5 to 15, it wasn't so dramatic. We did get some mortality at 15 as compared to 5, but we had relatively equal amounts of top growth from 5 to 15, and we did get a depression in the root mass from 5 to 15, and again from 15 to 25. So we're going to be doing these studies for the other groups of grasses that I showed, and trying to get a handle on what the upper level of salt tolerance is of these conservation plants. And again, this is just in the greenhouse over an 8-week growing period, but we're also doing field plantings to sort of compare what we're finding in the greenhouse versus what we're finding in the field. And there's another plant, which is not a grass, it's actually a broadleaf plant called seashore mallow, which grows in scattered stands in the marsh. But the University of Delaware has been looking at this particular plant for probably 20 years or so, and has made collections from the Texas Gulf Coast all the way up through Delaware, and has been looking at different accessions and different and looking at the amount of seed production versus the amount of root production from this plant. And it also has the has the ability to, it's an obligate wetland plant, so it grows in wet sites, but it also has the ability to grow in drier sites, and of course is very highly salt tolerant. And you can it produces a lot of good viable seed. You can actually plant stands of it like this as a monocultural stand, which could be potentially be used in those, again, those transitional areas where you can't grow a regular commodity crop, but you could grow something else. And this has a high value for pollinator standpoint. The stems can be crushed and ground and be used for animal bedding. And the seed is a high oil seed, which there's been some research done that it could be potentially help produce a biodiesel crop from the seed itself. So again, we're a long way from promoting seashore mallow for a biodiesel crop, but it's something that's sort of in the early stages, and it's a conservation plant that has a value added potential income. And then using woody plants, again, as I mentioned, for shoreline stabilization, that can be harvested when dormant. You get sprouting and rooting along the stem, and can be used to stabilize stream banks and shoreline. So there's another potential use of some conservation plants in these salt affected areas and flood affected areas. For example, in Europe, they're actually using the halophyte, the salicornia, the glasswort, or they call it samphire over there, for the restaurant industry, and they're getting anywhere between $20,000 and $35,000 per hectare, or a little over 2 acres, for the restaurant industry as a garnish, as to use in soups and things. So so there is value for some native plants that grow in the environment, from a value added standpoint. And in fact, that particular plant also was it has been looked at from a biofuel standpoint. And the United Arab Emirates actually produced a fuel from Salicornia that was an aviation fuel that actually flew an airline flight from Abu Dhabi to Amsterdam back in 2019. So again, we're in the early stages of this, but some of these native plants can actually have the value added and can be used for multiple uses. We're also looking at putting some of these plants, the same group of plants that I've already talked about, on dredge material that has been land spread. So more and more dredge, beneficial use of dredge. There's been some work looking at thin layering in the marsh to build up the elevation of the marsh, but also looking at land application of dredge that's non-contaminated. But the problem is it does have a high level of salts in it, and in some cases it has sulfates, which under oxidizing conditions can turn the soil really acid. And so we had a trial in farm in Estelle Manor looking at a few of our grasses and what they might tolerate as far as the dredge material goes. And again, when you first apply this, it's high salt, and then as it oxidizes, the pH goes down, so it's very acid. But then the salt will eventually leach or run off, and then you're left with pretty much a soil that can be a low pH or highly acidic, but yet has a lot of organic matter in it. And we've found that our conservation plants have grown very well in this material: the prairie cordgrass, the American beach grass, the salt meadow cordgrass, the coastal panic grass, and even the seashore mallow. So here's just an example of a farm in Cape May County that is doing a lot of the right things. So they've implemented various conservation practices. They preserved the riparian forest buffer, which is on the west side of the farm and breaks up the northwest winds in the winter. They are expanding their herbaceous buffer along the tidal creek, again to have that buffering capacity of the native grass to help protect the vineyard. They utilize irrigation water management. They're growing an alternative niche crop, that being the beach plum for wine production and for fruit production. And then they even make the claim that having a nominal amount of salt spray on the grapes imparts a unique taste to the wine. So they're actually using it as a marketing campaign, the salt spray. So it's not impossible to grow plants and have a farm and to grow crops in a salt rich environment. It just takes a lot more planning and a lot of adaptation and some mitigation. So as far as BMPs for coastal resilience, selecting plant species that are tolerant to salinity and increased temperatures, flood and salt tolerant plants, plant them inland from where they are now, from where the wetland is now, to sort of be more proactive and prolong the viability to rising waters and increase flood frequency. And then, of course, broadening the diversity of plantings is probably the most important thing to be able to be more resilient to changing salinity and flooding conditions. And my last slide is just sort of food for thought. So back in 2008 or 2009, when the Department of Energy was really looking strongly at bioenergy crops, and to a certain extent still are, but it was even more of an emphasis back then. There was a chief scientist with NASA, believe it or not, the Langley Research Center in Virginia, who was really interested in this whole issue of saline agriculture. And his thoughts were that historically we think of saltwater as being bad or disastrous for agriculture, but he felt back then that that some unconventional thinking is that that saline agriculture is actually a viable to even desirable alternative to conventional agriculture in some circumstances. So I guess that maybe is a glimmer of hope that not is all lost with rising sea level and more frequent flooding from saltwater, that farms can adapt. Obviously our complete agricultural system is not going to be converted to saline agriculture overnight, but there have been successes like the Netherlands crop using the Salicornia, or like the biofuel production from Salicornia in the Middle East. And I think we also have some successes, or can have future successes, for some of the conservation plants that I mentioned in the future, and maybe getting them into more commercial production and as alternatives to our regular commodity crops or vegetable crops. So I just wanted to leave you with that thought that that not all's lost with the saltwater situation. So with that, I guess I'm done, and I'll entertain any questions.
Thanks, Chris. That was very interesting and informative. We do have a whole bunch of questions.
All
but-
right.
Which, before we start with the questions, though, I did want to mention the poll is open. So whether you're using a computer or a phone or a tablet computer, you should be able to access that that poll. And some people have started that. I also did want to introduce myself, which I failed to do at the beginning of this talk. My name's Sal Mangiafico. I work for Rutgers Cooperative Extension, and I did want to thank the other panelists here tonight, Amy Rowe, Michelle Bacchus, Steve Yerjo, and Doug Zemeckis, all of whom tonight helped with wrangling questions and technical matters. And we are the team that puts together this webinar series. I did want to mention that next week will be our last webinar in this Weathering the Storm series. And that's planning for the unplanned, preparing for marine debris by Jessica Conway, who works for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Marine Debris Program. So with my little spiel done, we can jump right into questions. There are quite a few. One question is about the Kirkwood-Cohansey Aquifer. As many of us know, the Kirkwood-Cohansey Aquifer is a large unconfined aquifer that encompasses a large area in southern New Jersey. And of course, we rely on that for agricultural irrigation, drinking water for homes, and so on. Is the Kirkwood-Cohansey being impacted by saltwater intrusion?
I'm not a geologist, but I believe that's a much deeper aquifer. So I'm pretty sure that that's not being impacted, at least not on the short term, by saltwater.
Yeah,
you know,
it's quite a large aquifer. So certainly most of its recharge area isn't going to be right near the coastal areas.
Right, correct. Now, I just want to mention that, I mean, there, Cape May City, has a desalinization plant because, they pull so much water out of whatever, and I'm not sure what aquifer they're actually pulling water out of for their drinking water supplies for the city. But, but they do have a desalinization plant. And actually, I believe they're getting funding for a new plant because during the summertime, when you have the influx of tourists, they're drawing so much fresh water out of the freshwater aquifer, that they're actually, pulling salt water in. Of course, they're in a more vulnerable location, being right down there on the tip of the peninsula too. I don't believe that's the Kirkwood-Cohansey aquifer that they're pulling from there, though. I'm not sure which one it is, but there is such a high level of groundwater withdrawal in some municipalities, in particular along the coast, that they do have to put in a desalinization plant to get rid of the salt that they're pulling in, from the deep aquifers.
Yeah, and I did want to mention that this is, I guess, one of the dreaded, more of a comment than a questions. But even though you're focusing a lot on agriculture, living in a small town near the Delaware Bay, we do have potential concerns with rising tides, storm surges, high tides due to the moon, and so on. Where we do have a town that is protected, where we have dikes protecting homes, agricultural land, historic buildings, roadways. So it's a safety issue as well.
Right.
And of course, that brackish bay water coming in, just to emphasize the point that it's affecting, question things like potentially septic systems, landscape plants, people's homes, people's basements, those kind of things. So it's
Right.
not, it's
Sure.
not just agriculture that's affected by this.
Right. Right. It's affecting everything. You're right.
I did like those ebb and flow tables. I thought that was great.
Yeah, it's relatively new. We upgraded our greenhouse and we added those, and that's been kind of a cool little thing. We it took us a while to develop the protocol actually to get good data from those, and really it involved not having a typical potting mix that would accumulate the salts, and give you a false reading. In other words, if you have a large amount of exchange sites on whatever material you're growing the plants in, they're going to accumulate salt over time if you're adding salt, through the water. We didn't want to get a false reading, so we opted for having the roots growing in perlite, and which is non-reactive, and it's not holding any of the salt ions, any of the cations. And so it's not giving us a false reading. So whatever's the concentration of the water is, that's what the plant is being subject to. So
Hmm.
it took a while to figure that out on how to really do that. And we are also feeding we're actually fertilizing through the water also, as well as adding salts to specific concentrations.
There's some questions about Phragmites in terms of it being kind of intruding in some of these areas with changing coastlines and sea level or bay level levels.
Hmm.
Any thoughts on combating the spread of Phragmites, or maybe is Phragmites potentially helpful for any of the things you're talking about?
Yes, to both. um, so Phragmites is certainly is you know is predominant in the landscape and predominant along coastal areas, and will invade fields that are abandoned because of salt and because of flooding. Um, it's probably not the most desirable plant to have from a habitat standpoint, and you want to have more diversity than maybe just a monoculture of Phragmites. But there's also, some research that shows that from a water quality standpoint, it's actually it's not a bad plant to have. I'll put it that way. It's actually a decent plant to have from a water quality improvement standpoint. And if based on that research where saltwater flooding into former farm fields is actually releasing nitrates and phosphorus, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have Phragmites growing at the edge of the field between the water course and the upland soil. So when they're in that marsh area, in that transition area, it's not necessarily a bad thing because it's actually probably helping scrub some of that phosphorus and nitrogen out of the water, and out
Hmm.
of the soil column. Um, so we typically use like 20 parts per thousand. So if it gets much above 20 parts per thousand, then the Phragmites tends to be a little less predominant. If it's below 20 parts per thousand, then it will continue to spread, and and can be somewhat invasive. So yes, it will be somewhat invasive. And we're also we've had other studies looking at putting in probably the best we can do with Phragmites, other than just trying to obviously spray it and many years on end to try to eliminate it, is to have it be there. It might still be there, but have it as part of a more diverse planting. So we're looking at other species that might, be coexist with it.
Hmm.
And I think that's about the best we can do, is have other species coexist with it. That being salt meadow cordgrass, that being switchgrass. There's a giant cordgrass, which is a Spartina sinusoides, that it seems to coexist with it. Eastern gamagrass can coexist with it. So by introducing some of these other more desirable native grasses into an area that's being impacted potentially by Phragmites, if you can get a mixture of those it's better than having just a monoculture of Phragmites, we think. So that's the other
Yeah.
advantage of having those buffers there at the edge of field, a diverse buffer, is that yes, you might get frag invading in those areas, but it won't just be, most likely won't just be frag. It'll be a lot of other things too.
Yeah, that's interesting. Any thoughts on revegetating some of the ghost forests we have, where we have these large areas where the trees have died from saltwater intrusion or simply water inundation?
Well, yeah, I mean that's a little tougher trying to go back in. I mean, what's happening is you're losing the woody component, and even not just the trees but you're also losing some of the shrubs, and it's being replaced by more herbaceous. So, I mean, if you have if it's not just Phragmites again, if it's a mixture of other herbaceous species that volunteer in on those areas. I mean that's probably about the best we can do, because I don't think you're going to be able to go back in with the higher water table, whether it's freshwater or saltwater, and go in and plant trees and have them survive. So I think we're just looking at trying to manage that loss as best as possible, and having maybe a replacement herbaceous community, as
Hmm.
opposed to having the forest. That's a tough one.
Yeah. Do you know much about living shorelines? It's specifically about mitigating the effects of sea level rise.
Well, I know living shorelines are pretty much a hybrid combination, or a combination of some structural measures, as well as using vegetation. Sure, they're good. They're definitely using living shorelines is a lot better than using a structural measure. And living shorelines can typically, because they're sort of a combination of structural and vegetative, they can tolerate a higher level of wave energy than can just a vegetative treatment. In other words,
Hmm.
in a lot of cases, we want to just go in and plant Spartina and plant beach grass, and walk away and say, hey, it's going to stabilize the shoreline. But because of there's a lot of different factors: boat wake, the width of the beach. There's a lot of different factors that can influence whether your shoreline stabilization is successful. You're going to be more successful with a hybrid approach, i.e., a living shoreline approach, than you will just with a vegetative only approach in most cases.
Hmm.
And certainly it's more desirable than having just a structural approach too, because just having a bulkhead or a rock wall or a gabion wall or whatever is just going to deflect the energy somewhere else and cause additional problems. Whereas a living shoreline is designed to sort of inherently absorb the wave energy on site rather than deflect it somewhere else. So,
Hmm.
so really, yeah, the ultimate is the living shoreline, because it's going to be higher, because you still have a lot of living matter. You have a lot of vegetative matter, and you have tolerance to higher wave energies, and so you have the best of both worlds, so to speak. If it's a really low energy site, you might be able to get by with vegetative only, but there's less. And maybe if you're way up on a high on a tidal creek, inland on a tidal creek, where you don't have a lot of open water and it's very low energy, you could get by with just vegetative. But in most cases, it's going to be a hybrid approach, which is the best, which is a living shoreline.
Sounds good. Couple other questions. There was a question about compost, specifically organic compost, and salt levels. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, you don't want to use like for example, a mushroom compost is high in salts, so you don't want to incorporate more or bring more salts into an already salty environment, so to speak. So things like leaf compost and You know, even manures in some cases can have high levels of salts, whether it's poultry litter or whether it's you know, say
Right.
dairy manure. You can have salts that you're bringing in. So any type of organic, you know, like maybe food waste compost is organic. Probably actually horse manure is probably not so bad. You know, there's typically not a high level of salts in horse manure, I don't believe. So horse manure compost, leaf compost, those are all good. And again, by having that organic matter there, you're basically creating a lot more exchange sites. So whatever salts are there, so it kind of get diluted. You know, they're not as concentrated. The more exchange sites you have, and of course, the better infiltration you have. And if you're using mulches or residues, you're reducing the amount of transpiration of water from the surface, so you're not sucking salt up to the surface. So it's all good to have that organic matter in those residues.
Right.
But but yeah, no sewage sludge, no no manures that have salts in it, no mushroom compost. You know, those are all potentially bad.
Yeah. And the thought I had is it's relative. Well, it's quite cheap and easy to measure the electrical conductivity of something
Yes.
like a compost. So
Mm-hmm.
so if you can find somebody who has a EC meter, it should be rather cheap and easy to do.
Correct.
One of
Yes.
the things that's easy to measure in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. It sure is.
Last couple questions here, and I'll just give them both to you together. One, there were some questions about the Cape May Material Center itself in terms of if plants are available, maybe for organizations, if there's a way for people to request assistance. We've seen some of the or get additional information. And then the other question was about if there are farms in the area. In this case, the person asking about Atlantic County, Cape May County area. If there's farms where they can go and look at things like buffers and riparian areas that are protecting crop areas.
You know, so that is a loaded question. There's many different parts. Okay, so here's how we operate. So we are much like our soil scientists do soil investigations and soil mapping for the agency. We do the plant testing for the agency. So we're actually support people to. I mean, we're a support division of NRCS that provides plant technology support to our technical specialists, i.e., our biologists, our grazing land specialists, our state resource conservationists, our agronomists, and our field staff. So typically we work through them. So they may have a landowner that's planning a particular practice and that they want to do something maybe a little different, or they want to do something that the field staff knows that we've been working on, and so they'll ask us for assistance, and we might go out and put in a demonstration planting or help the field office, you know, with plant recommendations, things like that. um, so that's kind of how we use our plants for demonstration evaluation purposes, as well as doing our own evaluation plantings. However, from a commercial production and distribution standpoint, we actually work with a third party, meaning the Cape Atlantic Conservation District, and we distribute plant materials to interested growers and seed producers. And that's how our material gets into the commercial marketplace. So for wide scale distribution, we prefer that it be done by the private entities, you know, the seed producers, the nurserymen who are growing our material, and then provide that material to projects like for example, I'll use American beach grass, our beach grass as an example. So the Army Corps of Engineers specs for all these beach replenishment projects. They spec Cape American beach grass, which is a product of us, of one of our first releases back in the 70s. Um, and so it's grown by, so Cape American beach grass is actually grown by about 20, somewhere around 25 producers in the mid-Atlantic and Northeast. southeast. So if, say from the Carolinas up to Massachusetts, there are about 25 producers of American beach grass. So whenever a job is let, whenever a planting contractor gets the work to do to plant a dune through the Army Corps of Engineers, they'll reach out to one of those growers to get the quantity of beach grass that they need. The grass was selected here and developed at our facility, but we only maintain a small amount of what we call breeder material that we distribute to growers. So the growers are the ones that increase it and make it available for sale. We do small demonstrations, either independently on our own or through field offices. So that's kind of how we operate. We don't just provide plants to anybody everywhere. We just don't produce that much on site, and most of it we either use to distribute to growers, or we use it for our own evaluation or demonstration purposes.
Mhm.
So as far as like riparian buffers that you could go see, I mean, we work with our Vineland Surface Center, which services Atlantic, Cape May, and Cumberland counties, and they would probably be better, more knowledgeable where some of these buffers may be to view or to see. It would be on private farms for the
Right.
most part.
Yeah, and so by Vineland Service Center, you mean the NRCS?
The NRCS Vineland, yeah, the Vineland Service Center, which is our field staff people, that actually work directly with the producers and farmers.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like the suggestion is that for landowners, whether it's agricultural or homeowners, maybe, well, for agriculture, reaching out to the NRCS may be a good place to start.
Correct.
For homeowners, maybe your local soil conservation district or your cooperative extension office in your county
Yep.
might be
Right.
good places to start.
Right. That's correct. And was there another part of that question that I didn't answer?
I think you got that. If I could just throw a couple quick ones at you.
Okay.
There's a question, well, road salts on landscaping plants.
Oh, yes. That's actually road salts on landscaping plants, as well as road salts that run off into streams, into freshwater streams, is becoming more and more of an issue, particularly in Pennsylvania, and I suppose to a certain extent in New Jersey too.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's the same. I mean, where was it? Like along the roads, I often see coastal shrubs and coastal plants that are actually planted intentionally for landscaping purposes where there is salt impacts.
Mm-hmm.
Like bayberry, for instance, the blue root in the blue root around Philly, believe it or not, yeah, 476. I've seen some of their median plantings, and it's coastal shrubs. It's bayberry and beach plum, and I think they have volunteers of the backer. I don't know if they planted baccharis, which is a groundsel bush, which is a coastal shrub, but they intentionally planted those median plantings to accommodate the salt, or to survive the salt, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also, I mean, sometimes being on the side of the road or the side even of a sidewalk is a tough environment for a plant, in terms of there can be added heat from that surface. There can be poor soils where you might need drought tolerant plants or compaction tolerant plants. So there's a lot of it's a hard life for a landscape plant.
Yes, it is.
There was a note about that also sewage sludge can have heavy metals in it.
Oh, yes.
Which for agricultural application is a whole host of considerations that go into play there. But yeah,
Oh,
it's always
yeah.
a
So that's
concern.
why we don't recommend sewage sludge either for organic. Now, even this, I mentioned the dredge material that's being land applied on a couple farms in southern Atlantic County. It has been highly tested and made sure that there are no heavy metal contaminants in the dredge material also.
Mm-hmm.
So DEP is actually, controlling or monitoring that very closely. And they're making sure that it's clean dredge, that that it doesn't have any metals in it. However, you still have the issue of the high salts, and you have the sulfides that will oxidize and become sulfuric acid and drop the pH pretty low and become acidic. So those are some issues that were of concern, but
Mhm.
not the metals. And hopefully that won't happen, where we'll have land applied dredge that has metals in it. That wouldn't be good.
Right. Yeah. So even your local pond or small lake can accumulate all sorts of things over the decades at the bottom. So when they're dredged out, those materials are often tested pretty thoroughly before they decide what they can do with them.
Right. Right.
And
But
there
it
was
was encouraging. I was just gonna. It was encouraging to see how well some of our plants did in that material, considering that it was high salt initially and then turned very acid.
hmm
Um, and it's somewhat buffered because of the texture. It was a fine texture. It was high organic matter material, so it was somewhat buffered by that. But very very good performance of those plants, and the folks were happy to see that.
and finally, there was a question about grants, specifically federal grants, to help farmers with some of these mitigation practices.
Well, it could potentially be through the farm bill programs, possibly, well, of course, easements, if in fact you're going to abandon and allow the land to convert and get some money for, converting the land to salt marsh. I mean, that's an easement program within our agency. As far as grants go, I'm not aware of any grants per se through USDA that would address that. I mean, again, we got the farm bill programs, and I don't know all the ins and outs of all the programs,
hmm
but there's the EQIP program, and there's the easement program, and there's a few other programs, and it would be the field office staff, that would be better answer the question about that.
Right. So again, someone in agriculture or other large land manager might start with the NRCS, and homeowners and such might start with their local extension office, cooperative extension, or in some cases, the soil conservation district, depending on
Yes.
where you live and what's available.
Yes. Now, researchers get grants through different groups and organizations to do research in this environment, but that's from an academic, standpoint, not from a, from a landowner standpoint.
Okay, so hopefully we've touched on most of the questions, at least the broad categories of questions. So I thank everyone for
Okay.
their questions. That's great to have a lot of interest and a lot of questions and interest from the audience. And I'd like to thank you, Chris, for your talk tonight. It was really interesting, really great, and lots of nice photos, which I appreciate as well.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay,
It was a pleasure.
thanks everybody. Good night, and we hope to see you next week.
Good luck with your last one.
Thanks.
All right.